So today I want to talk about thinking. And speaking of thinking, William just told you she's a professor of rhetorical studies, probably not quite even sure what that means, and now she wants to talk about thinking. Now seems like a good time to maybe check your email, use the restroom, get ready for Wayne, right? But hear me out. I have a problem, and it isn't that I'm the most boring woman in the world, as my job title might suggest. Rather, I have a problem with letting opportunity pass me by. Everyone in here, at one point or another, has missed that opportunity to develop a new relationship, romantic, friendship, business, or otherwise, because you got too caught up in thinking about how to communicate your message with the person on the receiving end. It's kind of like that email that you spend way too much time thinking about and overanalyzing. It ends up being 2 sentences, and you spent an excessive amount of time thinking about what to put in those 2 sentences, right? Or what about that proposal that you never submitted? Or that song or dance that you never performed? Maybe that piece of writing, that artwork that you never published? All because you thought you had not fully exhausted all of the resources available to you to make it just perfect. It's kind of like when we avoid joining the gym because we're not fit enough or healthy enough or strong enough. Like, isn't that the point, right? Isn't that why we go? So one of my personal favorites is I might start planning a vacation, for example, and I will spend a lot of time thinking about where we should go for vacation. And I have to get all of the information, analyze all that information to figure out where's going to be the best place to go. And then I've got to figure out where we're going to stay once we get there and what things we're going to do once we get there. And I spend so much time over-planning this, overthinking it, that I could have probably picked up a couple extra side jobs and paid for a couple extra vacations, right? And so we all do this. Like, this is a habit that many of us have, right? You can all relate to these examples. We have a habit of overthinking, overanalyzing, planning, and trying to perfect a lot of these things in our life. And it interferes with opportunities that are available to us. And one of the reasons that we get so caught up in this planning stuff is that we have to make decisions. And decision making is hard. Like, it's actually pretty painful sometimes making decisions. And I don't just mean this as a metaphor. Quite literally, decision making can be painful. Researchers in the social sciences have found that taking an over-the-counter pain reliever prior to making a difficult decision can actually help to reduce the amount of pain we feel when making decisions. So I don't tell you this to promote taking an over-the-counter pain reliever every time you need to make a decision, but rather my point is to highlight that the same neural pathways associated with decision-making are those associated with physical pain. So yes, making decisions can physically hurt. And where does this come from? Well, the same researchers, or researchers in the same field, have been telling us for a very long time, this is nothing new, that this comes from fear and anxiety. We have fear and anxiety because of a perceived risk. And this perceived risk, we lead into this fear and anxiety, and that leads us into this need or these attempts to try to control that perceived risk. And while we get stuck in that perceived risk and thinking about decisions and the different actions and ideas that might go with that, we end up in this sort of perpetual cycle, this loop of analysis paralysis, right? That's where we get stuck, and that's why we end up spending too much time on things that we shouldn't spend so much time on, and that's where we end up missing opportunities. So this is kind of what that looks like. We've got fear and anxiety, and that leads into this need to control perceived risk, which leads us into that cycle of analysis paralysis and those missed opportunities. And let me tell you something. A little over 9 months ago, my children and I unexpectedly experienced the loss of my husband. And there's something about a significant loss, about grief, and about trauma that makes you not want to miss opportunities anymore, especially those opportunities to build new relationships, to grow your mind, and to gain experiences. And so that's what I want to talk about today. How can we get out of our heads? How can we get out of analysis paralysis and into a place where we are engaging and embracing the opportunities that avail themselves to us? So my solution to analysis paralysis is a subscription to mediocrity. Yes, that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, right? That was actually in the title of my talk. So I understand we don't like this idea of mediocrity, though, right? Like, why would we subscribe to mediocrity? We'd rather slam our fingers in the car door. That actually sounds terrible. But let's break it down. We might think about mediocrity as something that is not horrible, but it's also not good. Like, it's below average, right? And we're very uncomfortable with that. That's pretty normal. Nobody's first choice restaurant is the mediocre restaurant, right? And so I would ask you, could there be a place in our lives, though, for mediocrity? Might there actually be a time when we want to actively and consciously practice mediocrity? Hint, the answer is yes, there is. And let's go back to that restaurant example. Nobody's first choice restaurant is the mediocre restaurant, right? But if all of the restaurants we would choose ahead of the mediocre restaurant are going to be busy, if we are in a rush, if we really just need some fuel for our bodies, we might go to the mediocre restaurant. That might be the best choice given the situation, right? It's going to satisfy our needs. It's going to get us what we need. And so my point is, many of you can relate to this example, right? You have done this. You know what I'm talking about, or you've done something very similar. And so what I'm talking about is being both selective and realistic in what it is that we want to perfect. So it's not that we can't overplan or overthink or overanalyze. There are things that probably warrant themselves for us to overthink and overplan and overanalyze. But we can be selective about when we're going to do that and how we're going to do that. So with the restaurant example, there may be a time when we really do want to put some planning into a certain dining experience, and it's probably a time when we are celebrating a special occasion, right? But if you're just dealing with somebody like my brother who gets hangry, you just need to get that dude some food, right? And so you might settle for the mediocre restaurant. Now, that's alarming though, right? This idea of settling, like, we don't really like that. And as a college professor, I also need to make sure that my students aren't saying, but Ashlynn, we saw your talk and you said that it's okay, like good enough is good enough, so here's what we're submitting because it's good enough, right? We submitted something. To be absolutely certain, I am not promoting carelessness, complacency, indifference, or laziness. Rather, I'm promoting an active and conscious effort to commit to a decision or to an idea or a course of action, because that gets us out of that analysis paralysis and into that area of opportunity. So how do we do this, right? We call this selective perfectionism, but how can we do selective perfectionism? And that's where this idea of mediocrity really comes in. It's that label. By labeling the things that we know are not exactly perfect, but that are adequate, by labeling those things as mediocre, we reduce the amount of cognitive dissonance or discomfort that we feel from being simultaneously hyper-attentive to detail and feeling like we're being rushed, like we're making a hasty decision. And so it's that label, again, that imperfect, labeling those imperfect things or what it is that we are putting out there that is very imperfect as mediocre. We know it's not actually mediocre, right? It's better than mediocre. But by labeling it as mediocre, we exaggerate it, we overdetermine it. And by doing that, we sort of build this space. We give ourselves this extra space in which we can act a little more freely. And so here's kind of what that might look like. So we've got analysis paralysis, but now to get out of analysis paralysis, we are going to subscribe to mediocrity or label the things that we do that are not completely perfect because of the constraints of a situation as mediocre. And that's going to demonstrate our awareness of and kind of give us ownership over that imperfection which allows us the freedom then to act and to actually execute and do what it is we want to do. So let's put this all together in an example. When a rancher is fencing, the rancher probably prefers that every fence post is perfectly aligned, equal distance apart, nice and straight, right? But the reality of the situation is that the rancher probably has a broke-down tractor that needs repaired, cattle that needs fed, water that needs moved on or off the field, and a list of endless tasks. So if the rancher can construct a fence that works, one that is maybe not perfect, but keeps the cattle in one area and out of another, that's okay, right? That's sufficient. That's adequate. Which one do we like to keep our cattle in, right? So if the rancher can construct the fence that is finished and that works and that might be a little imperfect and we can kind of joke about how it's maybe a mediocre fence but it's doing its job, the rancher can then also move on to these other opportunities. And perhaps the rancher is able to repair the broke-down tractor that is needed to help feed said cattle. Or maybe the rancher is able now to be more selective about moving the water on or off the field because that's actually something that comes at a greater cost. And now the rancher's available to spend more time planning out that process. So this subscription to mediocrity becomes a tool for us, right? A tool to get out of that analysis paralysis. It allows us, again, that freedom to act. It becomes a kind of coping mechanism or a survival skill, if you will, that lets us move forward. In conclusion, I offer you the potential of a subscription to mediocrity, where we selectively choose what it is that we are going to overthink, overanalyze, and perfect, while labeling as mediocre the things that we know are adequate within a given situation. And we're okay with subscribing to mediocrity because we know there's nothing mediocre about the mediocrity I'm proposing. We don't need to be perfect to move mountains, and we don't need to move the mountains perfectly. We just need to do it. That movement is opportunity. It's opportunity for greater balance in our lives, better physical and mental health, and overall greater peace of mind. Thank you.